This is Jed Disler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. I think that this episode I should call The Piano Geek rather than The Piano Maven, because I'm going to get very geeky in terms of detail and chapter and verse and discographical trivia and all kinds of arcane stuff, which I guess is inevitable when you talk about a pianist like Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli. This is the second of what I think will total 3 episodes about box sets devoted to Michelangeli. This pianist lived from 1920 until 1995, and many professionals and pianophiles considered Michelangeli to be in a class of his own. He was a pianist whose technical finish and whose total mastery of tonal application and control of timbre were held in awe by his colleagues. Of all the pianists one could consider to be perfectionists, Michelangeli definitely took the cake. And, if conditions weren't perfect, if his pianos were not voiced or calibrated to his painstaking specifications, if the temperature in the venue was not just so, he would be likely to cancel. And it's safe to say that Michelangeli probably canceled more concerts than he actually played. But when he did show up, and he would usually show up with 2 different pianos and his own piano technicians, the audience members, more often than not, consisted of a who's who of the piano world. Just like when Vladimir Horowitz played, you would always find famous pianists in the audience. Come to think of it, you would always see piano celebrities in attendance at Alicia de la Rocha's concerts as well. And like Horowitz, and like the conductor Carlos Kleiber, Michelangeli understood value in scarcity. And as he got older and older, he became choosier and choosier about where and when to perform, and also when not to appear. It may come as no surprise that Michelangeli made relatively few studio recordings for a pianist of his stature. And as such, piano mavens and collectors and geeks have habitually sought out broadcasts or live recordings that either circulated in the so-called tape underground or would appear on independent labels. Back in the 1990s, the Italian Aura label, that's spelled A-U-R-A, brought out tons of live Michelangeli material on individual CDs and also in several box sets. I'd like to talk about one of these box sets. It's really quite hard to find, but it was a pretty substantial project that I think warrants a serious discussion, and you should know about it. It had 15 CDs in it, along with a booklet that contained extensive essays in Italian, translated into English as well. And one of the essays was this impossibly rambling and discombobulated memoir from the woman who was Michelangeli's widow. But at least this essay, or whatever you want to call it, gives a lot of vivid memories of Michelangeli's early years, even going back to when he was a little boy. The name of this collection is called Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli Hommage. It came out in the year 2000, I think. Yes, it did. Definitely, it came out in 2000. It has the catalog number AUR 2000-2. So if you're hunting for it, you can type that into your search engine and maybe you'll even find a copy. I wrote a rather general review of this box set back in the early days of ClassicsToday.com, and I've posted a link to that review in this episode's description. But I'm going to go through each and every disc for this talk. Disc 1 contains the Debussy Preludes Book 1, recorded live at the Vatican on April 29th, 1977. The interpretations essentially are the same as those in Michelangeli's Deutsche Grammophon studio recordings issued in 1978, but in less good sound and with less dynamic differentiation and some heavy-handedness in places. I think part of this has to do with the slightly drab and airless sonics of the Vatican recordings. Discs 2 and 3 contain Michelangeli's complete June 13th, 1987 Vatican recital from the following decade. It's a very long and generous program. The first half contain Beethoven's Sonata No. 3 in C major, Opus 2 No. 3, and both books of Debussy's Hommage. The second half began with Chopin's Andante Spianato and Grand Polonaise, and it concluded with Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit. That's a very big program, come to think of it. Much of this playing is proficient enough, but it's kind of musically stiff, and Michelangeli's interpretation of the Beethoven Sonata, which he had played all throughout his career, I think had grown more and more calcified over time. And the Debussy Hommage have almost none of the tonal magic and subtle nuance of his Deutsche Grammophon studio recordings. And Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, which was once a specialty of the house with Michelangeli, receives a really charmless and kind of unyielding performance. And the fabled precision that we know from Michelangeli's great 1959 BBC recording of Gaspard de la Nuit has slightly eroded in both Ondine and Scarbo. It's true that Michelangeli still spins out a very pearly cantabile line in the Chopin Andante Spianato, but honestly, the Polonaise here goes over like a lead balloon, and it's really no match for how Michelangeli played this piece, especially in his early 60s television version issued on LP and CD by Cetera, and I talked about that when I was talking about the Michelangeli Complete Warner Recordings box set. But filling out CD number 3, however, are really subtle and refined readings recorded in Torino in 1962 of Chopin's A minor Mazurka, Opus 68, number 2, the D-flat Mazurka, Opus 30, number 3. Well, actually, that one is a little harsh and emphatic, so it's not that subtle. Also, there's the B minor Mazurka Opus 33, number 4. Now, how many Michelangeli performances of that Mazurka exist? Quite a few. And there's a brisk yet beautifully shaped berceuse here, and there are 3 Chopin waltzes to round this out. CDs numbers 4 and 5 preserve a recital from Bregenz that took place on January 15th, 1988. This is kind of late for Michelangeli. It sounds as if the source is an audience tape, maybe made on a Walkman. I mean, I have no idea, but it's certainly not professional sounding. The first 3 pieces, which are 3 Scarlatti sonatas, go pretty well. They're not as fresh as you would hear in earlier Michelangeli Scarlatti performances, but they're still okay. And then the Bach Busoni Chaconne is next, and this performance is slower and much more monumental than in Michelangeli's famous late 1940s HMV studio recording. And then he plays the Brahms Paganini variations, and unlike Michelangeli's earlier performances of this piece, here he plays them in Brahms' running order, and he doesn't monkey around with the text as he used to do. But I have to say that even though Michelangeli gets through the notes, there's really no sense of effortlessness or lightness or characterful contrast, and I think it's a rather dull performance, to be frank. Then Michelangeli plays Chopin's A minor waltz, Opus 34, number 2, and he stretches out phrases to Kingdom Come, and then he similarly diddles and dawdles over the trio of Chopin's B minor scherzo. You know, the theme of this trio section is based on a Polish song called Sleep, My Jesus, and all I can say about this rendition is, Jesus, it put me to sleep. But the outer sections catch reasonable fire at times. And this recital concludes with Beethoven's Sonata number 32 in C minor, opus 111. I think the interpretation is interesting. It still retains Michelangeli's anachronistic breaking of hands and arpeggiated chords from his earlier recordings, but it doesn't have the awesome pianistic sheen of the 1961 BBC Opus 111 or his 1964 Decca studio recording. I think the older Michelangeli almost sounds like a caricature of his younger self. Somehow the rhetorical exaggerations and the cragginess of it all appeal to me. And filling out this disc are some Chopin selections from a recital in Brescia, recorded in June 1967. There are 6 mazurkas, and there's the first ballade. And it's excellent playing, but they are presented here ever so slightly off pitch. That's a shame. But also on this disc is the Liszt Concerto No. 1, recorded in Tokyo in April of 1965, with the Yomiuri Symphony under the direction of Jindřich Rohan. And it preserves Michelangeli's staggering rendition of the piano part. Oh my God, this is amazing piano playing. And he often plays decorative passages in tempo to quite scintillating effect, and the kind of fire and ice sensibility that so often characterizes Michelangelian virtuoso repertoire totally comes across in the concerto. But the sound quality is not all that great, and the orchestra, honestly, leaves a lot to be desired. CD number 6 offers 2 air checks taken from Michelangeli's first American tour in the late 1940s, and you have to put up with lousy sound in order to appreciate the remarkable pianistic mastery in a Schumann concerto with Dmitri Mitropoulos from 1948, as well as the Franck symphonic variations from Los Angeles with Alfred Wallenstein conducting. That was from 1949. It's too bad this is the only performance that exists, so far as I know, of Michelangeli playing the Franck symphonic variations. And the Schumann, by the way, is pitched sharp, so that makes it a non-starter. And filling out disc number 6 is that amazingly poised 1942 studio recording on Telefunken of the Grieg Concerto. And this must be the worst transfer I've ever heard of the Grieg Concerto. I discussed this recording in my talk about the Michelangeli Complete Warner recordings. CD number 7 gives us a recital that Michelangeli gave in the Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires on July 21st, 1949, or at least part of the recital, and he is on absolutely fantastic form in the Beethoven Opus 2 No. 3 Sonata. He plays the Chopin Mazurkas in A minor, Opus 68 No. 2, and the inevitable B minor, Opus 33 No. 4, and the Andante Spianato and Gran Polonaise, and there are encores by Grieg and Galuppi, and what a shame that the sound quality is so horrible and distorted in this recital, but at least it's on pitch. On CD number 8, we have a recital from Helsinki, and it's preserved in decent, though rather dry and dynamically constricted sound, but here, Michelangeli is at the peak of his powers in 5 Scarlatti sonatas, but he also plays the Schumann Faschischfunk aus Wien, and his interpretation is starting to get stiffer and more atrophied in the first movement when you compare this to his great live 1957 Royal Festival Hall performance or his BBC broadcast from the same year. It really pales. In both books of Debussy's Hommage, Michelangeli shows a little more freedom and impulsiveness compared to the Deutsche Grammophon studio recordings that he would make the following year in 1970, and I frankly prefer the studio recordings. But these 1969 Helsinki Hommage are atypically unfettered and I think kind of interesting, and I like the freedom in the performances. The 9th CD is part of an audio soundtrack of the April 7th, 1981 Lugano recital, which you also have on video. And here we have performances of Schubert's A minor sonata, Deutsch number 537, and the 4 Brahms ballades, opus 10. And there's not much interpretive difference between these Lugano performances and the Deutsche Grammophon studio recordings of these pieces released later in 1981. And you used to be able to find these performances on DVD. Also on this recital were Beethoven's sonatas numbers 11 and 26, but they're not in this box set. Okay, we are at CD number 10. We're moving along here. We've got Mozart's Concerto number 15 in B-flat, Herschel 450, in a live 1974 performance with Edmund de Stoutz and the Zurich Chamber Orchestra. This is a concerto that figured pretty regularly throughout Michelangeli's career and his discography. Years ago, when I reviewed a reissue of Michelangeli's 1950 studio recording of this piece, I said that the pianist subjects each phrase to finely tuned gradations of touch and dynamic scaling, leaving not one note unscrutinized and unaccounted for. And that's pretty true about this performance. The sound quality is a bit reverberant and it lacks bottom. And to be honest, there are better recorded and conducted examples of Michelangeli in this concerto. Also on this disc is the only known recording of Michelangeli in chamber music. It preserves a performance of Mozart's piano quartet in E-flat, Herschel 493, with the violinist Jean-Pierre Wallet, violist Claude-Henri Joubert, and the cellist Frankie Dariel. This performance took place on September 19th, 1972, on a cruise ship, of all places. This was a musical cruise that featured an array of star performers, and you would never expect somebody like Michelangeli to participate in such a venture and to play on a Yamaha piano at that, instead of the usual Steinway from Michelangeli. But surprisingly, Michelangeli agreed to this gig, and the story goes that originally, he was supposed to have played chamber music with Isaac Stern and Alexander Schneider, but at the end of their rehearsal, he closed the score and he said something to the effect of, "I cannot play with gypsies." So he agreed to play the Mozart quartet, but only on the condition that he could play it with Jean-Pierre Wallet. Apparently, Michelangeli totally dominated the rehearsals and gave absolutely no quarter to his colleagues. It was either Michelangeli's way or the highway. But it's a performance that I think is thoroughly integrated and unified and painstakingly detailed without sounding micromanaged. And the sound quality is not the greatest, but it's perfectly listenable, so it's an interesting curio. CD number 11 is a disc titled The Unknown Recordings, which is totally nonsense because all of these recordings are known, at least to Michelangeli specialists. It contains fragments from performances in Geneva from 1939 to 1941 of the Liszt First Concerto, the Grieg Concerto, and Beethoven's Emperor Concerto. These were published by Cetera. And there's also a handful of Michelangeli 78s from HMV Italy that I discussed in my podcast about the Warner box, except that these transfers are not as good as the ones in the Warner box, so we can pass over this disc, honestly. CD number 12 is really interesting. It is the live October 27th, 1982 Stuttgart performance of Debussy's Preludes, Book 2. And although the sound quality suggests that this recording was made from an audience machine, again, maybe a Sony Walkman or something like that, I don't know, the performances do tend to be faster and much more spontaneous than those in Michelangeli's 1988 studio recording of Book 2. And there's also a lovely performance of a short piece from Franz Liszt's Année de Pèlerinage, Book 1. This is a work he never otherwise recorded. I don't think any other Michelangeli performance of it has surfaced. As I said, it's not a professional sounding recording sonically, but your ears do adjust, and I really enjoyed hearing this again. CD number 13 gives us another audience recording, and this time from the Bregenz recital from March 3rd, 1985. All of the selections on this disc are by Chopin, and technically Michelangeli is on excellent form, although he's become more stentorian and studied with time. But if you can accept that, you will hear new details of voicing and balance in the four big works on this disc: the F minor Fantasy, the Second Scherzo, the First Ballade, and the Andante Spinato and Grand Polonaise. And these details are very interesting when you compare them to earlier performances. The G minor, Opus 67, number 2, Mazurka, and What Else, the B minor, Mazurka, Opus 33, number 4, are also more drawn out here than in earlier Michelangeli performances. But they do hold your attention, and I'm quite drawn to the playing on this recital, and your ears do adjust. And even with this audience recording, you do somehow get a sense of how Michelangeli had the ability to really project his tone to the fullest over the footlights. CD number 14 gives us the first half of the April 29th, 1977 Vatican concert, from which we already talked about the second half's Debussy Preludes Book 1, which are on CD number 1 in this set. If we didn't have better Michelangeli performances elsewhere of the Brahms Ballades, Opus 10, and the Chopin Piano Sonata number 2, we could probably accept these Vatican performances with all their dynamic limitations, but there are better Michelangeli versions to be had of these works. So as far as this disc is concerned, I give it a meh. And lastly, CD number 15 is a recording from Michelangeli's last London recital. This concert took place at the Barbican Centre on May 10th, 1990. And my comments about the Beethoven Opus 111 Sonata, the inevitable Chopin B minor Mazurka, and the B minor Scherzo and the Andante Spinato and Grand Polonaise from the 1985 and 88 concerts that I was talking about earlier largely pertain here. And the playing is even more stentorian and italicized compared to Michelangeli's interpretations from even just a few years earlier, certainly from earlier decades. But now in 1990, it's a little more technically labored, and, the notes are pretty much there, but the musical personality has grown more dour and I think even a little pretentious in regard to the rubatos. By and large, you can source all of, or at least most of the performances in this box set either on other independent labels or maybe even on YouTube. There was another box on Aura that duplicated some of this 15 CD set's contents, but it also offered some real gems that I wish had been in this box set, such as really wonderful live performances of the Brahms Ballades and the Paganini variations from Lugano on May 21st, 1973. Those are well worth checking out, and I think you can find those easily on YouTube or, if you dig around the catalog somewhat. Also, the 1981 Lugano Beethoven Sonatas 11 and 12 that I mentioned earlier were in this other box. The point is that all of these independent labels seem to copy and recopy and re-recopy all kinds of live Michelangeli recordings back and forth. And even with the Aura labels claim to being a quote-unquote authorized edition, honestly, who are we kidding? I've basically given up chasing down Michelangeli performances on independent labels of variable credibility, kind of in the same way that I long gave up trying to keep track of the vast Sviatoslav Richter discography, both official and unofficial. I mean, life is too short. But if you can find this Aura box set for a reasonable price, it might be worth it. And like I said, these performances can be accessed in various incarnations if you kind of hunt around for them. This is Jed Disler, and thank you for your patience as I've gone through 15 CDs worth of live and broadcast Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli performances. And if that holds any interest for you, then good luck hunting these recordings down. And there's really a lot to enjoy, honestly. So until the next time, take care, and I look forward to being with you for our next episode of The Piano Maven.